Hey, today we're going to be talking about 1.3 aquatic biomes. Take a moment, review the enduring understanding, check out the learning objective, and pause the video as you review the essential knowledge and set up your Cornell notes. Okay, so aquatic biomes are in the water, just like terrestrial biomes were on the land. So we will be discussing aquatic biomes, and an aquatic biome is characterized by three things: salinity, or the amount of salt that is present, the depth, or how deep something is, and the water flow, or whether the water is moving or not. So these three factors characterize an aquatic biome, which can provide drinking water for humans, provide recreation for humans, agriculture for humans, and also biodiversity for the environment. Now, you'll notice that I set up these little flow charts. I have these a lot of times multi-flow charts. Sometimes you're going to see they get really complex. This is a way of me just demonstrating the information. If your brain doesn't work in this function, set it up as a chart. If you need to take notes on this, there is very little benefit in copying something if you don't know why you copy it. Now, I will tell you that these are environmental, where you see the earth, and these are human. So on the right side, these are impacts, and these are causes. So three things that can cause or characterize an aquatic biome, and then these are things that are impacts or effects of an aquatic biome. Okay? So things we can do to test the water quality is we can test the pH, or how much hydrogen, or how many hydrogen ions are present. Hopefully you remember pH from chemistry. We'll be talking about that quite a bit. You can test the turbidity, or the clearness of the water. If there is dissolved or undissolved solids floating around, like you have basically a lot of murky water and it's kind of muddy looking, that will be a very high turbidity. Very low turbidity is like a glass of tap water. If you can see through it, it has a low turbidity. If you cannot see through it, it has a high turbidity. Salinity, you can test how much salt is present, and that basically can be done in a lab. And also check dissolved oxygen. The most important thing you can know about dissolved oxygen is warm water holds less oxygen. Cold water holds the most oxygen. As liquids get warmer, they don't hold gases as readily or as strongly, because the gases escape, because the particles move faster. Chemistry. Okay, so we have rivers and streams. Rivers and streams are moving. Typically, a river is going to be larger than a stream. There is no real distinction between what makes something a river, what makes it necessarily a stream, but typically it would be related to the size. Now, there are going to be nutrients if it is moving quite rapidly. There will be nutrients that are building up. So when you have these, any sort of undissolved solids, they may be organic material, or it might be other nutrients that are floating around in the water. But the faster moving water is going to have more stirred up nutrients, and it's going to have a lot more oxygen. Slower, more meandering rivers will have lower levels of oxygen, but might have more nutrient accumulation at the bottom. So because of this, you may have different types of producers. In a fast moving river, you're going to have plants that are attached to the maybe to the rocks, maybe to the soil in the riverbed. And in a slower moving river, you may have phytoplankton, or plankton that grows at the top of the river. And you can have different types of macroinvertebrates. Macroinvertebrates is just a fancy way of saying, honestly, larger, small organisms without backbones. So macroinvertebrates are typically ones you can see with your naked eye. You see here you have snails, you have some insect larvae. These are like dragonfly larvae, caddisfly larvae, and you don't have to know, but you might have an earthworm, different, maybe a crayfish, different things that are living in the water, like leeches or worms as well. Lakes and ponds are freshwater biomes, and they are stationary. There are a few different zones that you should understand. You have the littoral zone, and that is just the shoreline. So littoral is the shoreline. You have the benthic, and benthic means bottom. So it is the bottom layer. All of this is the benthic zone. And then you have the limnetic zone and the profundal zone. Typically, the limnetic zone is where you're going to have photosynthesis because it has adequate amounts of light penetration. Light doesn't penetrate that far down into the into bodies of water. There is a limit to how far light can go down. In different lakes, you might have a lot of suspended solids, you might have a lot of producers, phytoplankton. So depending on what is present in the water, sunlight will only go down so far. Freshwater wetlands are indicated by the type of vegetation, and they are either submerged or they are saturated. So it is either completely underwater or it is just really wet. And emergent vegetation just means you have plants that are coming out. Now, these can help to regulate floods. The plants that are present in these wetlands, plants act as two things, and I say this, you'll hear this a lot throughout the year. They act as a stapler and they act as a sponge. They act as a stapler because they're holding the soil in place. They act like a sponge because they're taking excess water and preventing it from running off. So one type of wetland is a swamp, and a swamp is where you're going to have emergent trees. So if you've ever been to Louisiana or seen different parts of like the Gulf Coast, is going to be very swampy. And then you will have an area like a marsh, and that is where you have different types of reeds or different types of wet grasses. Like you might see cattails in here. You can't really see that in there, but emergent grasses and emergent plants. And finally, a bog is where you're going to have emergent vegetation, but a bog is going to be very highly acidic. And bogs, typically, I've been to a bog and they're really cool, but they're very protected. But a bog, a lot of times, there's certain types of bogs where you literally are walking on a layer of organic material and it feels like there's water underneath it. And I did it in college back in Minnesota, and we're like walking, it feels like you're walking on a waterbed. Pretty cool. You have a salt marsh, and you see that this is New York City in the background. So we have salt marshes. In fact, this is around JFK Airport. And that's typically where a river and an ocean would meet. And this is often called an estuary. An estuary is where you have brackish water, and brackish water just means where you have fresh water. It's saltier than fresh water, but not quite as salty as the open ocean. So brackish water, like for example, the East River is brackish. Jamaica Bay areas by JFK are going to be brackish water. Up to the Hudson River, up to a certain point, is going to be brackish water. And this just means that it is a combination of fresh water and salt water. But these salt marshes also have plants emerging from them. They have a large amount of nutrients. They are very biodiverse. But these salt marshes can be drained and used for agriculture. But also these salt marshes have a large amount of biodiversity. A mangrove swamp. Now this is typically going to be found in tropical areas, and this was an awesome, I might talk about it this year, but last year I went to Belize, and these are pictures that I took of a mangrove swamp. And mangrove swamps are typically found in tropical areas around coastal waters, and they are creating this amazing habitat. Typically in tropical coastlines and tropical estuaries, they have these amazing habitats where there is a large amount of nutrients, and the roots are protecting different fish species. So you can help to preserve biodiversity. Another thing that this mangrove swamp would do is it will prevent, when you have a storm surge from a hurricane, this mangrove swamp will help to like hold back some of the flood waters, because it kind of acts like as a water break. So instead of the water crashing and eroding the shore, this can keep the beach from eroding and preserve the overall terrestrial habitat in storm events. Coral reefs have incredibly nutrient poor water, and therefore the coral need to form a mutualistic relationship. So we have the coral polyp, and basically it looks like an anemone, and this is really small. And then they have algae that are living within their surfaces, and the algae are what give them these amazing colors. And the algae complete photosynthesis and provide nutrients to the polyp. The polyp is going to provide home for the algae, and it's also providing carbon dioxide, so the algae can use the carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. So the polyp is going to release calcium carbonate, and it's getting the carbon dioxide from the ocean water, it's getting calcium from the ocean water, and it's making calcium carbonate. And this CaCO3, remember it, calcium carbonate, it's also called limestone. Okay, and this is what forms the actual coral reef. So the physical structure that is present is from calcium carbonate. And this forms an immensely diverse habitat that is the most diverse aquatic habitat on the planet. And in fact, it is between the coral reef and the tropical rainforest, they are the two most biodiverse biomes that we have on this planet. And there is a lot of problems with coral reefs due to coral bleaching, and we will be discussing coral bleaching in the future. We have the intertidal zone, and intertidal zone just means between, and it's the area between high tide and low tide. So what we've seen in New York is, you've probably seen those little birds, the little piping plovers, the one that run up. There was a Pixar movie about it. I think it was before, like Finding Dory. But it's the little birds, and they peck at the ground. They're looking for little invertebrates. That's in areas where we have beaches. But in other areas where you have a rocky tidal zone, you may have different organisms that are found at high tide and low tide. And typically the organisms that are found in this intertidal zone, they have to hold on to the rocky surfaces. So a lot of these, like barnacles, will attach themselves. Anemones will attach themselves. Some of the organisms, like hermit crabs and mussels, are able to move themselves, but they're also protected from these crashing wave water, or waves from the ocean. You also have the low tidal zone. You will have plants that will be submerged, and they'll have access to stronger levels of sunlight at lower tide, and at higher tide they might not photosynthesize as much. Now the open ocean is by far the largest biome on the planet. However, it is has incredibly low productivity. And that is because there is basically nothing. It's like a huge desert. Now there is an area where they have photosynthesis, and that is called the photic zone. So there is, overall, it has the highest level of productivity, total productivity. There is so much photosynthesis happening. However, it's such a large area that when you do the amount of productivity per unit area, it is actually very low level of productivity. But when you add it all up, it is the most productive, meaning the most photosynthesis. So here's the zones. You have this, again, intertidal zone, where you'll have organisms like snails living there. You have the photic zone, which is where you have photosynthesis. And then you have the aphotic zone, where photosynthesis is not occurring. It is kind of twilight appearing. The sunlight will only go down, certain wavelengths of light will go down to certain depths, and we will be doing a hands-on activity related to this. But the aphotic zone begins around 200 meters. Light will only go down about 200 meters before you hit the aphotic zone. And then you have the abyssal zone, and that is way down at the bottom of the ocean. And down here near the abyssal zone is where you see those like anglerfish, like the ones that have that weird little light. You might have some bioluminescent organisms down there as like a way of interacting with each other and or communicating or attracting prey. And at the very bottom, which I'll talk about in another slide, but we have the benthic zone. Remember, benthic just means bottom. And finally, we have this chemical reaction that you will see throughout this entire year. We have carbon dioxide, and that is atmospheric carbon dioxide, and water. When they mix, you get H2CO3. Notice there's 2 hydrogens, 1 carbon, and 3 oxygens. So all you do is add up the CO2, add up the H2O, and you get H2CO3, and that is carbonic acid. And this is a reversible reaction. So the carbon dioxide can mix with the water, form carbonic acid, but also that carbonic acid can also break apart, and the CO2 can be released as well. Now you're going to have at the bottom of the ocean these hydrothermal vents. And these hydrothermal vents just means that water, it's hot water coming out of these vents, and they're releasing hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is toxic to most organisms. However, the tube worms that live at the bottom of the ocean, this was only recently discovered within the last 30 to 50 years. But they are undergoing a process called chemosynthesis. So instead of using light, like photosynthesis, they're using chemicals. They're using this hydrogen sulfide in order to make their carbohydrates or synthesize their carbohydrates. So because of this, there is diversity at the bottom of the ocean, but it is chemical based and not solar based. All right, our FRQ practice. Identify a specific organism that is found in an aquatic biome and explain how an adaptation helps it to survive in that biome. So take a moment to respond to this question. I thank you for your attention, and I will see you soon.